Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Living Authentically, Becoming Your True Self, the podcast where we explore what it really means to live, speak and lead from a place of truth and kindness. I'm your host, Sue Whitaker. I'm a life transitions and identity coach. I guide individuals through significant life changes, helping them to rediscover their true selves and embrace new beginnings with confidence and clarity. So today's episode is actually one of my favourites. I wanted to talk about personal identity. So what I mean by this is having a look at some really complex topics such as core values and beliefs, as well as personality traits and emotional patterns. I have quite a lot to share with you on this, both from a professional and personal perspective, so I'm really excited to dive straight in. So first of all, one of the things I wanted to talk about was core values. The core values are what I would describe as deeply held beliefs and guiding principles that shape how we live, how we make decisions and interact with others around us in the world. They're like our internal compass, pointing you towards what feels right, meaningful and authentic in your life. From a personal perspective, they're what matters to you most. From my perspective, I wanted to let you know a little bit more about my experience in the working world. So I was in corporate HR for over 20 years and supported businesses with their values, as well as individuals with their values as part of their own development. The interesting thing I've always found about values is that there are a lot of words that can be associated as values, but actually identifying what is very important to you and matters most can actually be something that changes over time. So an example I've got for you is when someone enters the world of work, their benefits for the jobs that they actually are looking for, like money and time off, may be actually more important than somebody who's more experienced in their career, because they may value pensions and benefits, private medical insurance and other such things. So sure, the items are all important that I've just talked about, but the people with more life experience may have a broader perspective on what's more important and may actually want the longer term than the short term. This is a little bit the same for values. When you're earlier in your life, you may actually only have a few, and your life experiences will have an impact and influence on the values that you have. If you have difficulty trusting others, for example, both from a relationship perspective, family perspective, then honesty may well be a part of your core self as a value. When I began my own business, I revisited my own values, whilst me as an individual and also as my business, which is a separate entity. I used my own to determine what my business one should be. They're not exactly the same, but they are actually fairly well aligned. With a little bit of creativity, I put the business ones into an acronym called CARE, C-A-R-E. C is for compassion, A for authentic, R for respect, and E for encouragement. What that means is those four are ones that I'm passionate about, ones that I'm important about and want my business to actually reflect. As an individual, this is actually all underpinned by me exercising other values like kindness and gratitude. Identifying your core values is like uncovering the blueprint for your inner world. It's a powerful way to understand what truly drives you. Doing a coaching session on personal values with people is something I always enjoy doing, because I always enjoy getting into what they may believe that they want to be as a value, but actually what might actually be the truth. I could really go on and on about values, but what I'm actually going to do is talk a little bit about beliefs. So beliefs come in many different types, each shaping how we interpret the world, make decisions and relate to others. Now, does that actually sound a little bit similar to what I just said regarding values? Well, that is true because they are actually similar to values, but beliefs can change depending on a number of things like our heritage, background, environment, upbringing, etc., etc. One of the things that a lot of people can talk about these days is a limiting belief. So what actually is a limiting belief? Well, it's a thought or conviction you accept as truth, but that belief holds you back in some way. It's like wearing invisible handcuffs made of doubt, fear, or past experiences. They usually stem from past experiences, societal conditioning, or childhood messages. Think of them as a framework that influences your thoughts and behaviours. I actually recently recorded another podcast episode, which you'll get to later in the season, and we actually spoke a little bit about limiting beliefs. One of the interesting things I really found was that you don't actually have to have a large traumatic experience to have a limiting belief. All you have to do is have some negative experiences, and actually it might not be very many at all before they can formulate a limiting belief. So some examples of a limiting belief are things like saying, I'm not good enough, I'll never be successful, or I'm too old to change, or I can't possibly learn that new skill. The really good thing is that limiting beliefs are not permanent. They can be challenged and they can be changed over time with the right techniques. Now, when I say right techniques, what I mean is that obviously everybody is different. So what technique might work for you might not necessarily work for the person next to you. But overcoming limiting beliefs is like rewiring your mental operating system. Once you shift those internal narratives, your whole world can open up. At this point, you might be thinking, are limiting beliefs the same as negative self-talk? The reason why I say that is because when I was actually researching this and having a look at it, I actually thought the same. But the short answer is no. And I will talk a little bit about what negative self-talk is as well and how the two are related. So don't worry, I will come back to that. But just to finish on the limiting beliefs, they're like the root cause of the convictions that shape how you see yourself and the world. They often operate subconsciously and feel like truths, even though they're just mental stories. So again, let me share a little bit about my personal background. When I was really, really young, I actually had quite a few night terrors. I don't exactly know why they started, but I knew that I was actually under 11 years old when they began. The reason why I know that is because I was actually in my first childhood home. My parents' bedroom was actually a long way down the corridor, and what that meant was that it was out of sight when it was dark. My bedroom was near the bathroom and the top of the stairs. One of my reoccurring dreams actually came from a long-winded story called Peter and the Wolf. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but there was an orchestral version of Peter and the Wolf. It's one of those less popular childhood stories, but nonetheless, they were there. Peter and the Wolf actually had other animals that were involved, and what happened was there was an orchestral accompaniment, if you like. So birds were played in the song as flutes and various other things. I don't quite remember even exactly how much the story was or whether I took it in at the time because I was quite young. But what I do remember is once that story was told to me, I had night terrors about a wolf. It was a large black wolf, and what happened was the wolf would actually appear in between my mum and dad's bedroom, and then it would make its way down the corridor towards my bedroom. It meant that the one place I wanted to go for security and safety, I couldn't get to. Now, I don't remember the wolf actually reaching me. It was more about the fact that I couldn't get to my parents, and I really wanted to. Now, I'm not an expert in dreams, so I'm not going to overanalyze it. But what I would say is that made me grow up with a limiting belief that I had bad dreams and also that I didn't like wolves. Now, the interesting part of that is, obviously as a child, wolves and dogs were actually very similar to me. So again, that limiting belief expanded a little bit to say that I didn't like dogs. Now, I don't know whether it was just because dogs were bigger than me, or whether my mum had a negative experience with dogs, but she was also worried. And if she was worried, then unfortunately, as her only child, I was worried too. The great thing about this is that what I've come to learn, obviously, over time, is that I actually really like dogs and I really like wolves, although I've not been up close and personal with them yet, although it is something I'd like to do. I don't quite know exactly why that link was made in my brain, but it was something and a limiting belief that I could actually stop. Now, when I talk about it, I realise how scared I was as a child. But growing up and having life experience and factual information, I really could just put it down to the fact that it was a dream. And yes, I didn't like the wolf in my dream, but that didn't mean that I didn't like all wolves, if that makes sense. Anyway, that sounds like a bit of a long-winded experience to say I've had limiting beliefs and I still have some of them today, and I'm always looking at ways to disprove them. One of the techniques that I use is always looking at the information and logical approach. Am I going to do this? Am I going to fail? Well, what's the evidence for that? Do I actually know that that's what's going to happen? I have limiting beliefs that says what happens if it doesn't work. And I often have to reframe my mind to say, well, but what happens if it goes right or goes well? Now, it might sound actually pretty simple, but the reality is that I've had to do a lot of self-discovery myself to understand what my limiting beliefs are, and also what techniques can work for me to make sure that I can overturn them, if you will, or reframe them, or reshape them, whatever way you think works. The interesting part about limiting beliefs is that they are really not permanent, and sometimes they can be a little bit fantasy. But the reality of it is that no matter how improbable they might sound, in your mind, they are real. And sometimes, even if you think about the logic behind it, if you had a negative experience, and take mine, for example, if you've had a bad experience with a dog, then your brain will add the 2 and 2 together, even if they don't make 4, but they make 3,000. I don't know where that number just came from. But anyway, the key thing is that we can look at subconsciously dealing with them. And the more that we actually are aware of them, the more that we can actually then have our own dialogue about them. So this is the part where I then actually go on to negative self-talk. So, negative self-talk is the internal dialogue that reflects and reinforces those limited beliefs. It's the voice in your head that criticizes you, doubts you, or even tries to shame you. Now, some people will actually say that they're very aware of what I'm talking about. Not everybody in the world has an internal dialogue. And to me, as a neurodivergent thinker, that just seems a little bit crazy. I think that there are also people, not necessarily who are neurodivergent, that have an internal monologue or dialogue, shall we say, But one of the things that I would say is if you have an internal dialogue, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's the little voice in your head that says, don't try that, you might mess it up. Or, I'm just going to fail at that, so I won't bother doing it. Or, you trip over something, a lead or a stump or something that's been there pretty permanently, and every time you do it, you basically say to yourself, oh, I'm such an idiot. Why did I do that? Another way to describe it, or I actually describe it myself personally, is my inner critic. It's often triggered by stress, by failure, or by comparison to others. And the comparison piece is really important, particularly in this day and age when we can see by social media lots of other people doing things, and from our perspective they might be doing things well. I'm not going to go too much into that because I actually want to approach that in another episode. So I'll leave that one right there. But what the inner critic can do is it can send you into a spiral of anxiety, low self-esteem, and self-sabotage. Now, some people may not have experienced those, but actually a lot of people will know exactly what I'm talking about. Again, this is where I insert another story. Self-sabotage. So when I was younger, self-sabotage was the thing for me. I didn't really know exactly what it was. All I knew is that if there was something that was going quite well, for some reason, something would happen that would always bring me down. And it might be that I got angry and broke something myself. It might be that I took too much time to get ready and wasn't able to get to the event that I'd been planning and looking forward to. I can't really tell you when I look back on those sorts of examples these days why that happened to me. But what I can tell you is that I think there was an inner part of me that felt that I didn't deserve for life to go well, and therefore I needed to actually make sure that I was living in a more negative space, even if I didn't really deserve it. Anyway, going back to the negative self-talk or the inner critic, it's a symptom, and quite often, we actually mistake this negative self-talk for the limiting belief. This is really important because the problem is that you've got to know which one to treat, and then the other one will be able to fall in line. So, a couple of examples for you. Limiting belief. I'm not worthy of love. So therefore, the negative self-talk will then be, of course I don't like you, you're not lovable, or you're not pretty enough to be loved. Another example of a limiting belief. I'm not good enough. Negative self-talk. Of course you're not going to be successful in that. You don't have the intelligence to be able to do that well. Again, it doesn't really matter how it's phrased, but there's a limiting belief and the negative self-talk is what builds onto it. So again, why does it matter? Well, unraveling the two means you can treat the cause and the symptom in different ways. So it's really important to know which one is the cause and which one is the symptom. So the cause is the belief, the limiting belief. Therefore, it is important that if you want to get rid of it, you challenge the belief with evidence and reframing. The symptom is negative self-talk. So the way to deal with the symptom is to interrupt it with compassion and affirmations, or something that will actually stop that inner critic being as loud and bold as they can be. The more you challenge the belief, the less negative self-talk you'll get. Now, I don't know about you, but I think if I was listening to this, I think I would be going, okay, Sue, I get what you're saying, but actually it's not something I can do. Well, I'm here to tell you that I actually did these things. I've challenged my limiting beliefs with evidence and reframing, and lo and behold, I've interrupted the negative self-talk. Now, don't get me wrong, we're all human, so it's not like I can say to you, oh, I never have a limiting belief in the future, I'm cured, or that I never have negative self-talk. But what I can honestly say to you when I think about it right now where I am, the negative self-talk has never been as quiet as it is now. And that's quite good for me energetically because honestly, it's been exhausting. One of the words that I actually mentioned just about interrupting negative self-talk is with compassion, and then I said affirmations. So affirmations are positive statements and things that you tell yourself. I'm not actually good at affirmations. It's not something that I actually connect with very well. But what I am very good at is compassion. Compassion for others. What I'm not really very good at is compassion for myself. So I had to actually turn it around for myself, which was a bit of a challenge. So one of the things I did when I needed to actually try and identify how I could use affirmations is I reframed it and looked at it as in a different way. So what I did was I looked at negative self-talk as an entity that was a negative person. What I then did was I looked at positive self-talk as another type of person, but almost more of a cheerleader type. And the cheerleader was being drowned out by the negative person. So I basically had to work out how to bring the cheerleader forward and send the negative person further back. I don't know if anybody's aware of it, but there's actually a story of two wolves, one light and one dark. And basically what they're saying is that you have both of them all the same time. But what you need to do is remember which one you listen to and which one you nourish and nurture. Or at least that's the core value of it. Anyway, the basic thing for me was at the beginning, the negative self-talk was there. And I had to pretend that my inner cheerleader was doing her best to shout louder and harder. I had to try and put in my mind's eye what they would say to me. And once I did this a few times, the negative self-talk was a little bit like a toddler having a tantrum. They would effectively fall to the ground and they would bang their fists, bang their feet on the ground and try and get a rise out of me by putting some other comments in there. It was really weird because as I got more deeper into understanding what I was doing, it actually was that the little negative self-talk toddler actually started saying things which were really quite odd and unbelievable. But they thought as long as they shouted loud and they basically tried to give me something to doubt myself, then they would be doing their job. Lo and behold, as the positive cheerleader started to actually have more of the space, more of the light as such, it then ended up that the negative self-talk just faded. And again, I'm not going to say to you that they're not there. But what I'm saying to you is that they're actually quite quiet. And even in times of stress or when I try and push myself, they don't come back with a loud band like marching drum or anything like that. So one of these things is, I would say, is if you're listening to this and you are actually struggling with low self-esteem or self-sabotage, this might be something that may help. So anyway, we've talked about values and we've talked about beliefs. And again, I could carry on talking about all of these a lot, and I enjoy working with my clients with them. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to stick to my script and go through some of the other areas that we talked about. So the next one I wanted to talk about is personality traits. So what are personality traits? Well, they're consistent patterns in how we think, feel and behave. And they're the psychological fingerprints that make each of us uniquely us. Whether you're the life of the party or the quiet observer in the corner, your traits shape how you experience the world and how others experience and interact with you. Now, one of the things that I've actually used many times in my corporate career is something called psychometric testing or personality testing. The purpose of these tools evidently was to identify what people's traits were, emotional patterns, etc. And it would be really helpful when actually helping to develop a team or even just hiring and recruitment people and trying to make sure that you could actually match people to the right roles, understanding their strengths, their development areas. Now, psychometric testing, there are various models. Some where they're based on letters like Myers-Briggs and others on colours like DISC or Berkman. It doesn't really actually matter which one you do, but however they're applied and reviewed, the output is all about your preference, how you want to work, rather than being one type or another. There's no good, there's no bad. There's just where you sit and where other people sit. So one of the great examples I've got is about extrovert and introvert. When I've actually had some of these personality tests done on me, I've always seemed to be in the middle. So I don't consider that to be completely alien, as I'm a trainer, I'm a speaker, etc. And when I'm in certain situations, like right now, I dial up the extrovert. But as an only child, I believe there was actually a point where I was a strong introvert in me. And when I do something particularly people orientated, I do find that it's better to actually have alone time to regenerate the social batteries. So when you're in the middle, you're often called an ambivert. Again, I'm not necessarily going to go too much into that detail, but that's one of the areas that psychometric testing can help. Understanding that you need that time to regenerate means that you don't then keep putting in people-orientated events, etc., so that you burn out. Personality traits are just that. It's a preference. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do something else on the other side of the spectrum. It just means this is where you naturally prefer. So if you're in a job that requires you to do a lot of public speaking, but actually you are quite nervous about it, then all that means is the psychometric testing is showing that you're going to need some support in that. Now, they don't just talk about personality traits. It can often talk about things like emotional patterns, and the two are deeply entwined. So emotional patterns are about how we experience, express, or regulate our emotions in everyday life. So think of the personality traits as the style of your emotional response, and the emotional patterns as the rhythm they follow. I guess one way would say is what makes you angry. And if you consume things that makes you angry, you become angry. But are you angry with inanimate objects? Or actually, are you quite extrovertly angry? So, other people will know that you're angry by how you interact. Now, one of the things that I would talk about is these traits don't just colour your emotional reaction. They also influence how you regulate your emotions. So again, someone who has a lot of high stress environment with work or personal and are highly conscientious, they might use planning techniques and reflection to manage stress. But if someone is actually going to struggle with that stress, then they might actually start to become quite emotional about reacting to it. They might start overthinking. Again, these are some really, really simplified ways of talking about it. But I just wanted to give some examples of what I mean. The thing about psychometric testing is it can't tell you everything. It can't tell you why you're like that. It can't even tell you necessarily how you're going to change. And that's part of the joy I've had before in interpreting them and trying to help other people understand what it means. Again, it doesn't mean that you're wrong or that you're missing anything. All it means is that you're spending time working out if you want to be more like that particular element, if you like, or trait. You want that trait to be dialed up. This is how you do it. And if you dial that trait up and it's something you're not comfortable with in exercising, a bit like a muscle, I guess, then you need to know what you're going to be able to do to rebuild that energy again. I actually could talk about that all day because I really do enjoy those sorts of things. And what I really find interesting is there are actually many other tools out there that sort of talk about similar things, but in slightly different ways. When I say different ways, do I mean good or better? I honestly don't know. But I think some people really like psychometric testing and other people really don't because they don't like being put into a box. I certainly like to use all of the tools that I can have and call upon to make sure that people have a really good understanding of what their values, their beliefs, their personality traits, and their emotional responses to. It's one of the reasons why when we talk about emotional regulation, I like to try and focus on what emotions they're going through, what are they finding difficult to regulate, and if they are regulating some better than others, then what might be the reasons behind that? So again, if I was in a coaching session about it, I would probably talk more about all of these individual emotions. What I am going to do, though, is I'm going to acknowledge the fact that I've already been talking for nearly about half an hour. And I can't believe I've actually got quite through a lot of that information myself. I'm not sure if I was talking quickly, and I really hope not, but I think I actually got my point over. The main thing is that a lot of these things are complex in terms of the topics we've talked about. And I could talk to you for a very long time about all of these things. But those 4 core elements are what make up your personal identity. Now, obviously, those sorts of values, etc., can change depending on what environment and circumstances you're in. And again, the podcast episodes I've got lined up for you are going to take you through some of those things. It doesn't mean that I'm never going to talk about values or beliefs in any other episode. All it means is that hopefully I've just dedicated this one episode to them so you can understand them a little bit better. So, without further ado, I'm going to leave it there for now, and I'm going to say thanks very much for listening and for joining me. And as always, if you think that this episode has resonated with you in some way and you want to hear more about it, or hear how I can help you with your own values, etc. and beliefs, then you can always connect with me on email or my social media platforms. And again, I'll leave the details in the episode description. But until then, and until next time that you hear the podcast, stay grounded, stay curious, and keep living authentically. Thanks very much, and bye now.